conclave had existed for 40,000 years. 40,000 years of order. 40,000 years of rules, treaties, and quiet power. 17 alien civilizations, some with scales, some with 6 limbs, some that communicated through light pulses in their chests, had built a system that governed nearly every corner of the Milky Way. They decided who got which star systems. They decided which species were allowed to develop faster than light travel. They decided who mattered and who did not. For 40,000 years, nobody had seriously challenged them. Then humanity arrived. It did not arrive quietly. It never did anything quietly. Within 200 years of leaving their home planet, humans had settled 43 worlds, built 11 space stations, developed their own version of FTL travel without anyone's permission, and were expanding in every direction at a rate that made the elder races deeply uncomfortable. Humans did not ask for territory. They simply went somewhere, built something, and called it home. The conclave watched this with growing unease. There were debates, long, slow debates the way the elder races always held them, measured in decades, full of careful language and ancient procedure. Some members of the conclave argued that humanity should be contacted, guided, brought into the fold as a junior member species under strict supervision. The Yelhari, a gentle race of tall, thin beings who communicated through soft musical tones, argued for patience. The Dolven, a quiet species who had spent most of their history studying mathematics, said the humans reminded them of themselves in their early years and should be given time. But the Keth Dominion was not patient. The Keth had 7 seats on the Conclave Council, the most of any single civilization, and they had spent 30 years watching humanity spread across the stars like water, finding cracks in stone. The Keth Senior Voice, a massive creature with dark-plated armor covering its body and 4 pale eyes that never seemed to blink, stood before the full council and made the argument simply. Humanity was not going to stop. Humanity was not going to ask permission. Humanity was going to keep growing until it was too large to contain, and by then it would be too late to do anything about it. The Keth Senior Voice used charts. It used projected growth models. It showed the council exactly what human expansion would look like in 500 years, and then in 1,000. The chamber went very quiet, and the vote was held 3 days later. 13 civilizations voted yes, 4 voted no. The measure passed. The file was labeled in the cold administrative language of the conclave. Extermination Protocol, Terra Zero. Nobody celebrated. That was perhaps the most chilling part of it. For the elder races, this was not a moment of anger or hatred. It was simply a decision, a solution to a problem. The conclave issued the order the same way they issued orders about trade routes and border adjustments, with paperwork, with procedure, with quiet efficiency. 14 fleets were assembled. Each one was enormous. Warships that dwarfed anything humanity had ever built, armed with weapons that could crack a planet's crust from orbit. The fleets were given their coordinates. Every human colony world, every human space station, every human ship, and the origin point, the small blue planet in the Sol system that had started it all. They moved at the same time. They dropped out of FTL at the same moment across dozens of star systems simultaneously because the conclave had wanted it to be fast, clean, total. It was a Tuesday on Earth, morning in most of the Northern Hemisphere. People were eating breakfast, going to work, taking their children to school. The sky above the cities was the same soft blue it had always been. A few people noticed something strange on their telescopes and personal scanners. Massive energy signatures appearing in orbit all at once. Some people posted about it online. Some people called it beautiful, thinking it was a meteor shower or some kind of natural event. Then the weapons opened fire. The conclave fleets did not pause. They did not send a message first. They did not offer a warning or a chance to surrender. There was no speech, no ultimatum, no final communication. There was simply the order, and then the execution of the order, carried out with all the emotion of a maintenance task. The first strikes hit Earth's major cities, then the military installations, then the communication hubs, then the power grids. Within 3 hours, Earth's entire defensive network, a system humanity had been quietly proud of, was ash. The warships then moved into position above the planet itself and began the final phase. Weapons designed specifically for what the conclave called planetary sterilization, fired in long, slow sweeps across the surface. The oceans boiled. The sky turned red, then black. The planet's crust cracked in a dozen places as heat tore through stone that had been sitting quietly for 4 billion years. The atmosphere, stripped layer by layer, peeled away into space. The blue planet that had given birth to something stubborn and strange and brilliant and loud. The planet that had produced music and war and art and science and every possible variety of foolishness and greatness went dark and silent and still. The same thing happened to 43 colony worlds, to 11 space stations, to every human vessel the conclave could find in open space. 340 billion people died in 6 hours. The conclave logged it, filed the report, scheduled a review in 50 years to confirm the absence of any surviving population. Then they moved on to other business. In what they did not know, what no one in the conclave knew, because humanity had been very, very careful, was that there were 17 ships they had not found. They were called the Arks in some of the internal human documents, though they had no single official name. They had been built quietly over decades, funded through channels so obscure and carefully buried that even most human governments hadn't known they existed. They were not built because of any specific intelligence about a conclave threat. They were not built because anyone had predicted what was coming. They were built because of something much simpler, a feeling shared by a small group of engineers and scientists and military planners who had looked at the galaxy and thought, we are very new here and very alone, and it would be wise to have a backup. Humanity had always been like that, always building shelters before the storm arrived, always keeping one eye on the exit. It was not paranoia exactly. It was something older and deeper, burned into human thinking by hundreds of thousands of years of living in a dangerous world where things went wrong without warning. The 17 arcs had been running dark for decades. No transponders, no active signals, no communication that could be detected or traced. They moved through space using minimal drive signatures, following routes that took them far from any known travel lanes. Each ship carried between 100,000 and 200,000 people. Scientists, engineers, soldiers, doctors, farmers, teachers, and children. Each ship carried seeds, genetic archives, manufacturing equipment, libraries of human knowledge, weapons, and enough raw material to build something new from nothing. When the conclave struck, the arcs were already moving. Their captains had protocols. If the primary warning signals from the colony network went dark all at once, they were to proceed immediately to the rendezvous point and not stop for anything. All 17 ships made it. They gathered in a region of space so unremarkable that the conclave's charts didn't even give it a name. A dense field of asteroids orbiting a dying red dwarf star that put out just enough dim light to make the rocks glow faintly. The conclave called this region the Hollow in a few old survey documents, noted it as resource poor and strategically worthless, and had not thought about it since. The ships cut their engines and drifted into the asteroid field and went completely silent. 2,400,000 people sat in the dark and waited. The first hours were the hardest. The communication systems were locked down, no signals in or out, so no one could know exactly what had happened. But the emergency protocols were specific, and the ship captains were disciplined, and everyone aboard already understood at some level that the silence meant the worst possible thing. Slowly in whispers, in fragments, the truth moved through the ships. Earth was gone. The colonies were gone. 340 billion people were dead. The sound that moved through those ships in the hours after the truth arrived was something no one who heard it ever forgot. It was not screaming. It was not chaos. It was something quieter and more terrible. A sound like the air going out of something enormous and alive. Parents holding children. People sitting on the floor of corridors with their backs against the wall and their faces in their hands. Soldiers who had trained their whole lives to be steady and unshakable, sitting completely still with wet eyes, staring at nothing. Commander Yara Ose Mensa heard it from the bridge of the lead ship, the HGFS Endurance. She was 51 years old, tall and lean, with close-cut gray hair, and the kind of face that had learned a long time ago not to show everything it felt. She had a daughter on one of the colony worlds. She did not let herself think about that yet. She sat in her command chair and listened to the sound of grief moving through her ship and through the fleet, and she did not move, and she did not speak for a long time. Then she opened the fleet-wide channel. Her voice, when it came, at her was steady, not cold. It was not the steadiness of someone who did not feel. It was the steadiness of someone who felt everything and had decided that falling apart was not something she could afford right now. Not yet. She said that she knew what everyone was feeling. She said that she felt it too. She said that the people who had done this expected silence to follow, expected that the last of humanity would drift in the dark and mourn and eventually fade. She said that they were going to be wrong. She gave the fleet 72 hours, 72 hours to grieve, to cry, to feel everything that needed to be felt. No work orders, no drills, no meetings. 72 hours for every person on every ship to be a human being and not a soldier or an engineer or a commander. After that, she said, they were going to get to work. She closed the channel. Outside the viewports of the Endurance, the asteroids drifted slowly around the dying red star. The light was dim and reddish and old. It did not look like Earth's sun. It did not look like anything warm or welcoming. It looked like the end of something. But the ships were still there. The people were still there. 2,400,000 human beings, breathing and thinking and grieving and alive, tucked into the rocks around a forgotten star in the middle of nowhere. The conclave had filed its report. The job was done. In their records, humanity was gone. In the hollow, in the dark, something that the conclave had no category for was just beginning. The 72 hours passed. Then Commander Yara Osi-Mensah opened the fleet channel again, and this time her voice carried something different. And the grief was still there. It would always be there like a scar that never fully disappeared. But underneath it was something harder, something with edges. She said 4 words. Let's get to work. What followed in the weeks after those 4 words was something that even the people living through it struggled to fully describe. There is a particular kind of energy that humans produce when they have been broken all the way down to nothing, and then decide, quietly, without ceremony, almost without discussion, that they are not going to stay broken. It is not the same as anger, though anger is part of it. It is not the same as hope, though hope is in there somewhere. It is something more practical than either. It is the energy of people who have decided that there is only one direction left to go, and they are going to go there as fast as they possibly can. Every person on every ship was cataloged. Skills, training, specialties, physical condition, psychological assessments. The data came back to the Endurance in long streams, and Commander Osi-Mensah and her council spent 48 hours reviewing all of it. What they had was remarkable, because the arcs had been designed not just to carry survivors, but to carry function. Every ship had been loaded with people chosen specifically for their ability to rebuild something from nothing. They had 312 physicists, 89 xenobiologists who had spent their careers studying alien technology and biology, over 400 engineers spanning every discipline from structural to quantum, 61 people who had worked specifically in alien communications and language, thousands of soldiers, many of them veterans of Earth's defense forces, who had been quietly recruited for the ARC program without being told the full reason why. Farmers, geneticists, doctors, programmers, teachers, psychologists, and scattered through all of it, the kind of brilliant, difficult, strange-thinking people that humanity always produced in every generation, the ones who looked at a problem from an angle nobody else had thought to try. Commander Osi-Mensah looked at all of this and felt something shift in her chest. Not hope exactly, more like recognition, like seeing a hand of cards and realizing slowly that it was better than it first appeared. The first order of business was survival. The asteroid field around the dying red dwarf was resource-rich in ways the Conclave surveys had missed, because the Conclave had been looking for specific minerals they valued and had not thought to look for what humans needed. The human geologists and mining engineers went to work immediately. Within 3 months, they had established the first extraction operations, pulling raw materials from the asteroids and feeding them into the manufacturing systems aboard the ships. The second order of business was security. The 17 ships were repositioned throughout the asteroid field in a pattern that made them nearly impossible to find by passive scanning. Every energy emission was carefully managed. The tiny amount of heat and light the ships produced was scattered and absorbed by the asteroid field itself. From the outside, there was nothing to find. The hollow looked exactly as it always had. Dead, unremarkable, not worth a second look. The third order of business was the hardest one. It was the one that Commander Osei Mensah had thought about the most during those first 72 hours of grief. The third order of business was understanding what had killed them and how. She called together every person with relevant expertise: physicists, weapons engineers, military analysts, former intelligence officers, and she gave them access to everything the ARCs had collected before going dark. Every scan, every recording, every fragment of data from the Conclave attack. She told them she needed to know exactly how the Conclave weapons worked. She needed to know what the Conclave ships were made of. She needed to know how they moved, how they communicated, how their FTL drives functioned. She needed to know every weakness, every limit, every assumption the elder races made about warfare and technology. Then she told them to build something better. It was not a simple task. Humanity's technology had been developing fast by the standards of young species, but it was still far behind the elder races in many areas. The Conclave had 40,000 years of accumulated knowledge. Humanity had, generously, a few hundred years of serious space development. The gap was real and it was large, and everyone in those early meetings knew it. But there were things that closed the gap in ways the Conclave had not anticipated. The first was necessity. When the alternative to success is extinction, people work differently. Sleep became a luxury most of the research teams treated as optional. The culture on the ships shifted in a strange way. People were not cheerful exactly, but they were focused in a way that felt almost physical, like a pressure in the air. Arguments happened. Humans always argued, but they were fast and productive, burning through disagreement to find the useful part underneath and then moving on. The second thing that closed the gap was the alien technology they had managed to collect. In the years before Terra Zero, human scientists operating near the edges of explored space had recovered fragments of Conclave equipment, damaged probes, the wreckage from old conflicts between elder races, abandoned outposts. Most of this material had been gathered quietly, carefully, and stored away for study. The ARCs had brought all of it. Now, with nothing else to do and everything to lose, the engineers took it apart completely. What they found was both impressive and, in certain ways, deeply encouraging. The Conclave technology was powerful, extraordinary in some areas, but it was also old, not just in the sense of being ancient, old in the sense of being finished thinking. The elder races had reached a certain level of capability thousands of years ago and had refined it, polished it, made it efficient. But they had largely stopped pushing at its fundamental principles. Why would they? It worked. It had always worked. Nobody had ever made them need anything more. A young physicist named Dr. Amara Solis, 29 years old and the kind of person who wrote equations on any flat surface available, including her own arm, spent 6 months staring at the core principles of the Conclave's FTL drive system. Then she wrote a paper that the senior engineers initially dismissed as too speculative. She argued that the Conclave's drive was built on an assumption, a very old assumption that had never been challenged, about how folded space interacted with mass. The assumption was not wrong exactly, but it was incomplete. If you approach the problem from a different angle, if you use the fold differently, you could achieve something the Conclave drives couldn't do. You could jump without a charge cycle, instant translation, no 30-second window where the ship was stationary and visible. It took 4 years to build a working prototype, then another 2 years to scale it. But when it worked, Commander Osei Mensah stood in the engine room of the Endurance and watched the test results come in and felt something she hadn't felt since before everything ended. She felt the cold, clean edge of an advantage. The weapons development went slower and then very fast. The early years were spent simply understanding what the Conclave weapons did at a fundamental physics level. Then came the period of trying to replicate it with human engineering principles. Then came the moment, around year 12, when a weapons team led by a former Earth defense engineer named Marcus Webb stopped trying to replicate conclave weapons and started asking a different question. The question was, what can't their weapons do? The answer, when they found it, was significant. Conclave weapons were designed for large-scale destruction, cracking planets, overwhelming defensive shields, destroying ships in open space. They were not designed for precision. They had never needed to be. When you have overwhelming force, you do not need to be precise. You just fire and everything dies. Human weapons, going forward, would be precise. Surgically, impossibly precise. Weapons that could disable a ship without destroying it. Weapons that could target a single system within a vessel. Weapons that could, in the right circumstances, fold space around an object and simply move it somewhere else. A principle Dr. Solis helped develop that would eventually produce the compression technology the Conclave would later find deeply unsettling. Year 15 saw the first new ship built entirely in the hollow. It was smaller than the Arks, fast and angular, built from asteroid materials with a human drive and human weapons, and not a single component the Conclave would have recognized. Commander Osei Mensa walked through it from bow to stern and said nothing for a long time. Then she said it was a good start. The engineers, who had not slept properly in 3 years, took that as the highest possible praise. The Ghost Fleet was born slowly, one ship at a time, assembled in the dark. By year 25, they had 41 vessels. Fast, quiet, armed with things the galaxy had never seen, crewed by people who had lost everything and had spent a quarter century becoming very, very good at one specific thing. Each crew member knew the name of the Conclave fleet that had struck their homeworld. Some of them had those names tattooed somewhere on their bodies. Some of them had the names of the people they had lost. Some of them had nothing visible. They just carried it in the way they carried everything, quietly and completely and without putting it down. The children who had been born in the hollow, and there were thousands of them now, the first generation of humans who had never seen Earth or a colony world, who had grown up in asteroid light and recycled air, were different in ways that were hard to define. They were not angrier than their parents. In some ways, they were calmer, but they had grown up with the mission as simply the background of existence. The way other children grew up with seasons or weather. They did not need to be convinced. They did not need to be motivated. They had been raised in a civilization that had one purpose, and they were its sharpest product. Commander Osei Mensa watched a group of them running combat drills in the training bay of the Endurance one afternoon and felt that complicated feeling again. Not quite pride, not quite grief, something that sat between both. These children had been born into loss. They had been born into the mission. They had never asked for any of it. But they were extraordinary, and they knew it, and they were ready. In year 30, she called the full council together. Every ship captain, every department head, every senior scientist and military officer. She put the fleet numbers on the table, the weapons assessments, the technology reports, the tactical planning documents that had been building for years. She asked the council if they were ready. There was a silence. Not the silence of uncertainty, the silence of people who had been waiting a long time for this particular question and were taking one moment to feel the weight of it fully before they answered. Then they answered. Somewhere in the Conclave's administrative archives, the file labeled Terra Zero sat closed and unreviewed. The 50-year review was 15 years away. The elder races were managing trade disputes and border negotiations and the slow business of governing a galaxy. They had not thought about humanity in decades. In the hollow around the dying red star with no name, 41 dark ships oriented themselves toward the wider galaxy, and humanity went hunting. The Conclave received the signal on a morning that had been, until that moment, completely ordinary. It came in on emergency frequencies, all of them simultaneously across every band the Conclave used. It came in 17 different languages, one for each member civilization, written in perfect diplomatic syntax with no grammatical errors and no cultural missteps. Whoever had written it had studied the elder races carefully. Every word was chosen with precision. The signal was impossible to ignore, impossible to block, and structured in a way that the Conclave's own communication protocols required them to formally acknowledge and record. The council chambers on Ethan Prime, the great ringed planet that served as the seat of conclave power, with its famous towers of pale stone and its atmosphere of cool, thin air that most species needed breathing assistance to tolerate, were in the middle of a routine session about mineral rights in the outer arc when the signal arrived. The conclave's communication systems flagged it as a maximum priority emergency transmission. Every screen in the chamber lit up at the same time. Every council member looked up from whatever they were doing. The message was a list. It began simply. A heading in all 17 languages that read, "These are the names of the people you killed." Then it began, name by name, world by world, colony by colony. The list moved in careful order, starting with Earth, then the first colony worlds, then the outer settlements, then the space stations, then the ships that had been destroyed in open space. Each name was accompanied by a home location, an age at time of death, assigned in a detail that several council members later said disturbed them more than anything else about the message. A single line describing who that person had been: a teacher, a child, age 4, a doctor who had delivered 3,000 babies over her career, a young man who had been on his first space flight going to visit his father on a colony world. 340 billion names. At standard data transmission rates, the full list took 11 days to send. The conclave could not shut it off. They tried. 3 times in the first hour, their communication administrators attempted to block the signal. Each time, it simply rerouted through a different frequency set, as though whoever was sending it had anticipated the attempt and already built around it. The signal was everywhere. It was in their systems the way water gets into a structure, finding every crack, filling every gap, impossible to fully stop without shutting down the conclave's entire communication network, which would have been its own kind of crisis. So they listened. For 11 days, the name of every human who had died in the Terra Zero operation moved through the communication systems of every conclave civilization. It appeared on screens in government buildings and private homes. It ran across information displays in public spaces on 17 worlds. Most species encountering it did not know what they were seeing at first. They had to look it up. When they found out, the reactions varied. Some were indifferent. Some were uncomfortable in ways they would not have been able to clearly articulate. On Yelhar, the home world of the gentle, a musical race that had voted against Terra Zero, the transmission caused something the Yelhari called deep resonance, a cultural response to witnessing significant loss. For 3 of the 11 days, large portions of Yelhari society stopped working and simply listened. On the Keth homeworld, the government tried to have the transmission classified and restricted to government channels. The attempt failed within 6 hours because the signal was already too embedded in the public networks to be contained. The Keth senior voice, who had argued for Terra Zero in the original vote, now older, the armor around his body thicker with age, watched the list scroll past on his private screen and felt the first trace of something he had not expected to feel. Something like unease. On the final day of the transmission, after the last name had been sent, there was a pause of exactly 1 hour. Then the second part of the message arrived. It was not a list. It was a data packet, compressed, structured, and very large. When the conclave's analysts opened it, they found sensor recordings. Military-grade scans, detailed and precise, showing the wreckage of something in open space near the Vega system. The analysts ran the identification protocols automatically, as procedure required, and then sat very still when the results came back. Conclave Fleet 7, all 41 ships. Fleet 7 had been one of the 14 fleets that carried out Terra Zero. After the operation, it had been reassigned to patrol duty in the Vega system, a routine posting that had been in place for decades without incident. When the last routine check-in from Fleet 7 had been received 42 standard days ago. When it had failed to check in again, the Conclave's communication office had logged it as a technical issue and scheduled a physical inspection in 30 days. This kind of administrative delay was not unusual. 40,000 years of smooth operation had produced a bureaucracy that moved slowly because it had never needed to move fast. Now the scan data was showing them why Fleet 7 had gone quiet. Every ship was there, all 41 of them, drifting in a loose formation in space, as if they had simply been turned off mid-flight. There was no debris field. There were no burn marks consistent with energy weapons. There was no evidence of explosive decompression or hull breach or any of the standard signs of combat. The ships looked, even from the outside, almost intact. Almost. The flagship of Fleet 7, a massive command vessel that was one of the largest warships the Conclave had ever built, had been changed. Its hull, which was constructed from a material so dense it could withstand direct impact from a planetary mass driver, had been compressed. The entire vessel, which had been nearly 2 kilometers long, now occupied a space roughly the size of a large dining table. It was a perfect cube, smooth-sided with a faint crystalline structure visible in the compressed metal. It was drifting alongside the other ships of the fleet as if it had been placed there deliberately, as if someone had wanted it to be found exactly like that, which they had. Attached to the data packet was one final file. It was a short audio recording. The voice that spoke was human, female, calm, with a measured pace that carried no anger, no emotion, no drama at all. It sounded like someone reading a weather report. "These are the names of the people you killed," it said, echoing the start of the list. "We remembered every name. We know every face. We know every world. We know every ship in your fleets and every weapon in your arsenals and every route your vessels travel. We have been watching you for a long time, and we have been learning. You filed us away. You stopped thinking about us. That was a mistake. You have 41 fleets remaining. We are patient people. This will be a long conversation." The recording ended. The conclave chamber was silent for a very long time. Then everyone started talking at once. And the orderly meeting that had been running smoothly for centuries dissolved into something the conclave had not experienced in living memory. Genuine panic. The 4 races who had voted against Terra Zero were the first to act. Within hours of the transmission ending, all 4 had opened separate back-channel communications, attempting to reach whoever was sending the messages. They used every diplomatic frequency they had. They sent signals to the coordinates implied by the data packet. They broadcast carefully worded statements of non-involvement into open space, hoping someone was listening. The Yelhari transmission was particularly detailed, going through their council record to show that they had argued against the action, that they had voted no, that they asked for dialogue and were willing to provide anything requested. And a response came back within a day. It was polite. It acknowledged the vote record. It said precisely, "We know who voted no. Stand aside and you will not be involved. This is not your war to fight or stop. Stay out of the lanes we use, and there will be no confusion." The Yelhari read this and immediately began the process of pulling all their vessels out of 17 different shipping lanes and patrol routes. They told no one they were doing it. They just quietly got out of the way. The 13 civilizations who had voted yes had a much worse few days. The Keth, who prided themselves on being the most militarily capable species in the conclave, immediately began mobilizing. They were not the type to wait for a second message. They dispatched 3 of their remaining patrol fleets toward the Vega system to investigate Fleet 7's wreckage and to sweep the surrounding space for any sign of the unknown vessels. The sweeps were thorough. The Keth were extremely good at this kind of search. They used every scanning technology available to them, covered enormous amounts of space, and found nothing at all, which was itself extremely unusual, because in 40,000 years of operating in this galaxy, the Keth had never searched for something and found nothing. They always found something. Space was not empty. Ships left traces, energy left traces. Even cold, dark, unpowered vessels had a signature, if you look closely enough. They found nothing because humanity had become very good at not being found. 30 years of hiding in the hollow had produced experts in making ships invisible. The Ghost Fleet moved through the search zone while the Keth were running their sweeps, passing through gaps in the search pattern with the ease of people who had studied Keth search protocols for years and knew exactly how they moved and where they looked, and crucially, where they did not. 3 of the Keth patrol ships went missing during the search. They were not destroyed. Their crews were fine, They found themselves somewhat confused in orbit around a remote ice planet in the outer arc, with no memory of how they got there, and every weapon system on their ships non-functional. It took them a week to effect repairs and signal their position. When they got back and reported what had happened, when the Keth Military Intelligence Division spent a month trying to figure out what technology could do that, they could not figure it out. This fact, more than the missing Fleet 7, more than the compressed cube of the flagship, more than the 11-day transmission, this was what truly frightened the Keth. They did not know what had been done to those 3 ships. They did not understand the method. And in 40,000 years, the Keth had never encountered a weapon or a technology they could not at least categorize. The council meetings became fractious. The 13 civilizations who had voted yes were now arguing about response strategies, about who bore more responsibility, about whether to attempt further military action or to seek negotiation. The Keth wanted to fight. Several of the smaller conclave members wanted to open talks immediately, sensing with considerable accuracy that fighting was going to go badly. 2 civilizations quietly contacted their embassies on Ethon Prime and began drawing up contingency plans for withdrawing from the conclave entirely if the situation deteriorated further. And through all of it, the Ghost Fleet moved. It moved in small groups mostly, 2 or 3 ships operating together, sliding through conclave space on routes that should have been impossible to navigate without detection. They were not engaging military targets yet, not in the way the conclave expected engagement to look. They were doing something that puzzled the conclave's military analysts for months before anyone figured out what it was. They were mapping everything, every patrol route, every supply line, every communication relay, every shipyard and fuel depot and repair station, every military installation, down to the small ones in the outer systems that hadn't been upgraded in a century. The Ghost Fleet was building a complete picture of conclave military infrastructure that was more detailed than anything the conclave's own administrative records contained, because the conclave's records were spread across 17 different civilizations with 17 different filing systems, and nobody had ever needed to compile them all in one place before. Humanity compiled them, organized them, analyzed them, found the gaps, the weaknesses, the nodes that, if removed, would cause the greatest disruption to the overall system. The conclave waited for an attack that looked like their idea of an attack. Ships emerging from FTL and opening fire. A fleet action. Something they had a procedure for. The attack, when it came, looked nothing like that. On a quiet standard day, 47 different conclave supply lines stopped functioning simultaneously. Not because the ships were destroyed, because every supply depot and fuel station along 47 specific routes had simply been emptied, drained. Every resource they contained was gone, taken with no trace of how it had been removed. A Keth patrol found one of the empty depots and reported that the interior was spotless. No signs of cutting equipment, no breach in the hull, no indication of forced entry. The supplies had been there on the last inventory check. Now they were not. The resources appeared 3 weeks later in anonymous caches near Yelhari and Dolvin space. The 2 species who had most vocally opposed Terra Zero. The caches contained a note, brief and plain. From those who remember what it means to have nothing. Use it well. The Yelhari received this and went very quiet for several days. When their senior diplomat finally made a public statement, she said only that they had received the materials and intended to return them through proper channels to whomever they rightly belonged. Nobody on the council asked her to clarify who she meant. In the hollow, Commander Osei Mensa sat in her command chair and reviewed the operation reports. Everything had gone as planned. Better than planned in a few areas. She read the section on the Yelhari response and allowed herself briefly a small expression that might have been satisfaction. Then she turned to the next page and began reading the plan for Phase 2. The Keth made their move in the 42nd month after the first transmission. They had spent those months preparing in the way the Keth always prepared. Methodically, aggressively, with the kind of total institutional focus that came from being a military civilization for 8,000 years. They pulled every available warship from patrol and garrison duty. They reassigned them to a single unified strike force under the command of their most senior war director, a Keth called Vraxin, who had won 14 fleet engagements in his career and had never lost a ship under his direct command. Vraxin was, by any objective military measure, exceptional. He was also the kind of commander who had read everything ever written about warfare and believed deeply in certain principles that 8,000 years of Keth dominance had proven correct over and over again. Superior firepower, properly applied, solved every military problem. He had 400 warships. He would find the humans wherever they were hiding, and he would end this. Commander Osei Mensa had been expecting the Keth to do something exactly like this. The Ghost Fleet's intelligence network had been tracking the buildup for 6 months, watching the Keth pull ships from their various postings and consolidate them. She had read everything recorded about Keth military doctrine. She had sat in planning sessions with her best tactical minds and gone through Vraxin's 14 engagements one by one, dissecting every decision he had made and mapping the principles underneath them. Then she had built something designed specifically to take those principles apart. The Keth fleet moved into a region of space near the galactic arm known as the Karath Corridor, a long stretch of relatively clear space that the Keth's search projections suggested the Ghost Fleet was most likely using as a travel route. Vraxin arranged his 400 ships in a formation he called the Net, a vast interconnected pattern that covered an enormous volume of space and could detect anything moving through it, then collapse inward to surround and destroy the detected target. It was a formation the Keth had used for 3,000 years. It was extremely effective against any enemy the Keth had ever faced. The problem was that the Ghost Fleet did not try to move through the net. The Ghost Fleet attacked the net from inside it. 17 human ships had been drifting in the Karath corridor for 3 weeks before the Keth arrived, sitting completely cold and dark within a field of naturally occurring metallic debris that masked their signatures. They had been there so long their crews had taken to calling the operation the Long Nap. When the Keth net began to form around them, the human ships did not move. They waited until the formation was complete and stable, until Vraxin had settled into his command pattern and his ships were holding position according to standard Keth protocol. Then the 17 ships activated simultaneously. What happened next lasted 8 minutes and was, by any analysis, not a battle in any traditional sense. It was a demonstration. The human ships did not move in formation. They scattered in 17 different directions at speeds the Keth scanners struggled to track, each one using its instant translation drive to jump inside the net's response range before the Keth could establish a targeting lock. The human weapons were precise in a way that Keth weapons were not designed to be. They did not destroy ships. They targeted specific systems within ships: drive cores, weapons arrays, communication hubs. One by one, Keth warships found themselves adrift and silent, not destroyed, not dead, simply turned off. Vraxin, to his credit, adapted faster than most commanders would have. He saw what was happening and issued new orders within the first 90 seconds. Pulling his formation tight, trying to use the massed firepower of the ships that were still functional to create a zone the human vessels could not move through safely. It was the right instinct. It might have worked against a different opponent, but the human ships had been designed for exactly this situation. They pulled back outside the effective range of the Keth weapons, hung in space just beyond where the Keth could reach them, and waited. Vraxin's formation held for 4 minutes. Then he realized that the ships on the outer edge of his formation, the ones that had not yet been disabled, were slowly going dark without anyone firing at them. He could not see how. His scanners showed nothing approaching them. His communication with those ships simply stopped one by one, with no warning. The compression field technology at long range was very quiet. When the 8 minutes were over, 372 Keth warships were disabled and drifting. 28 had managed to get far enough from the engagement zone to attempt FTL jumps back to Keth space. 17 of those jumps failed because the ship's drive systems had been quietly interfered with in ways the crews had not detected. They drifted alongside their colleagues. The remaining 11 ships made it back. Vraxin's ship was not among the 11. His vessel was intact. The humans had not harmed it, had not harmed anyone on it. It was simply not going anywhere. He sat in his command chair in a dead ship and did something he had never done in 40 years of military service. He sat and thought. Really thought, without the distraction of active command. And he went back through the 8 minutes in his memory and tried to find the moment he could have done something different, that would have changed the outcome. He could not find it. The human sent a short communication to his ship's backup emergency system, the one that ran on a completely separate power source and could not be disabled by the same methods they had used on everything else. It said that his crew's life support was fully functional and would remain so, that recovery vessels from Keth space were already being contacted to come collect the fleet, and that the humans suggested the Keth consider this result carefully before sending any more ships in this direction. It also included, as a courtesy, the tactical analysis of the engagement that the human commanders had written before it began, the document laying out exactly what they expected the Keth to do and exactly how they had planned to respond to each move. Every prediction had been correct. The engagement had gone almost precisely as planned, with the exception that it had taken 8 minutes instead of the 7 they had projected. Vraxin read this document for a long time. He was not an emotional creature by nature. The Keth valued control above most things. But something moved through him as he read, something cold and settled and honest. He sent a message back through the emergency system. It had only 4 words. In his own language, they translated roughly as, "You studied us completely." The response came back almost immediately. 2 words, "Yes, sorry." And he was not sure if the last word was sincere or something else. He suspected it was both. The news of the Karath corridor engagement hit the Conclave like a physical impact. 400 Keth warships, the finest military fleet of the most militaristic civilization in the Conclave, had been neutralized in 8 minutes without a single casualty on either side, without a single enemy ship destroyed, without, as far as anyone could determine, the humans losing so much as a hull panel. The arguments in the Conclave chambers became desperate. The Keth military faction, humiliated and furious, demanded a full military response from all 13 civilizations. A unified fleet of every warship available, a show of force so overwhelming that even these strange and impossible humans could not survive it. Other members pushed back hard. The Dulvan mathematical analyst produced a projection showing that given what had just happened at Karath, a unified fleet would likely produce the same result on a larger scale and would leave every Conclave civilization militarily stripped for years. Meanwhile, the Ghost Fleet kept moving. A Conclave shipyard in the Outer Arc, one of the largest capable of producing 40 warships a year, was found one morning to be completely empty. Every piece of manufacturing equipment, every stockpile of raw material, every partially assembled ship frame had been removed. The station itself was intact, not a wall scratched, the environmental system still running. It looked like a building after the furniture had been moved out. A careful examination of the station's logs showed no evidence of any ship docking. The station's external sensors showed no activity for the period when the removal must have occurred. The Conclave spent 3 weeks trying to figure out how it had been done. They could not. The equipment appeared shortly after, rebuilt and functional, somewhere in the asteroid field around a dim red dwarf that wasn't on most charts. 2 Conclave communication relay networks went dark. Not destroyed. The physical infrastructure was fine. The routing had simply been changed, redirected through channels the Conclave's own administrators no longer had access to. The information that used to flow through those networks was now flowing somewhere else, and whoever controlled it was using it to listen to everything the Conclave said on those channels, which meant the Ghost Fleet now knew, in real time, everything the Conclave's military planners were discussing. It was around this point that several of the smaller Conclave civilizations, ones who had voted yes on Terra Zero, largely because the Keth had made it clear there would be consequences for voting no, not because they had genuinely wanted humanity dead, began making very quiet inquiries about what exactly the process would look like for acknowledging wrongdoing. They asked their legal scholars to review relevant historical precedents. They asked their diplomats to draft language that expressed regret without explicitly admitting liability. They asked, through intermediaries, whether anyone had any idea how to contact the humans directly. The humans, it turned out, were already aware of these inquiries. They had been listening. Why? They sent individual responses to each of the civilizations that had reached out. The responses were polite, clear, and left no room for misunderstanding. They said that diplomacy was possible, that the humans were not interested in the destruction of any civilization, That accountability and reparations were things that could be discussed in a structured process, but that this process would happen on human terms, at a time of human choosing, after certain prior conditions had been met. The prior conditions were not listed, not yet. That uncertainty was, itself, a message. Commander Osei Mensah was 81 years old when she decided it was time for the final move. She sat in the planning room of the Endurance with her most trusted officers and looked at the intelligence maps covering every wall, every conclave fleet position, every military installation, every communication node, every weakness they had identified over years of careful work. She looked at all of it for a long time without speaking. Then she said they were going to Ethon Prime. The room was quiet for a moment. Ethon Prime, the seat of conclave power. The most heavily defended location in the galaxy, ringed with military installations built over 10,000 years, positioned to be approached from only 3 directions and fortified on all 3. The symbolic and practical heart of everything the conclave was. One of her captains said carefully that the defenses around Ethon Prime were formidable. Commander Osei Mensah said she was aware of that. Another officer said that a direct assault would be costly, possibly prohibitively so, even with everything they had. And Commander Osei Mensah said they were not going to assault it. She explained what they were going to do instead. As she explained it, the room got very quiet again, but a different kind of quiet this time. Not uncertain quiet. The quiet of people who were hearing something and understanding it and feeling the weight of how right it was. The Ghost Fleet moved in 3 days later. The approach was done in stages that the Conclave's defensive systems were not designed to detect, because the defensive systems had been designed to detect ships approaching from outside their range. The human vessels were already inside the range before the detection systems registered them, having navigated through a gap in coverage that existed because 3 separate Conclave administrative departments had, over several centuries, so each assumed the other was responsible for that particular sector, and none of them had ever checked. Humans had found this gap by reading the Conclave's own administrative records. The records were technically classified, but classification systems that had not been updated in 800 years were not especially difficult to access if you understood the underlying architecture. The Ghost Fleet emerged from concealment simultaneously around Ethon Prime. All 41 ships arrayed in a pattern that put them inside every defensive response range at once. The planet's military installations locked onto them immediately. The targeting systems were excellent, among the best ever built, and prepared to fire. And then stopped, because the human ships were not firing. They were not moving. They were just there, sitting in space around the most important planet in the galaxy and doing nothing at all. The Conclave's defense commander, a Keth officer named Sarath, who had replaced Vraxin after Karath, stared at his targeting displays for 11 seconds and then understood what was being communicated. This was not an attack. The humans could have fired. They had position, they had surprise, they had weapons that had already proven more capable than anything the Conclave had brought against them. If they had wanted to destroy Ethon Prime, they could have opened fire the moment they decloaked. They had not. Sarath ordered his gunners to hold. Commander Osei Mensah opened a channel to the full Conclave assembly. Every screen on Ethon Prime, every communication device, every channel, the same trick they had used with the nameless transmission, but this time from directly overhead, impossible to miss or dismiss. She did not make a long speech. She had never been someone who made long speeches. She said, "We have been everywhere you thought was safe. We have been in your councils and your shipyards and your supply lines and your communication networks. We have not come to destroy what you built. We have come to change how it works. You are going to come to the table now. You are going to bring your records and your legal scholars and your full council, all 13 who voted yes. And we are going to have a very long, very honest conversation about what you did and what you owe." She paused. "Now, let's discuss what you owe us." 7 words. The session came to order. The negotiations lasted 3 years. Not because the Conclave was in a position to argue. They were not. And everyone at the table understood this. The Ghost Fleet remained in position around Ethon Prime for the entire duration. Not menacing, not aggressive, simply there, present. A reminder if one was needed that the humans had come all this way and were in no hurry to leave without a satisfactory result. The negotiations lasted 3 years because the humans were thorough. They had brought legal scholars, people who had spent decades studying conclave law, conclave history, and the legal precedents of every member civilization. They had drafted the terms of the agreement before the first session began. Every clause had been considered. Every possible conclave counter-argument had been anticipated and answered. The document the humans put on the table on the first day was 314 pages long in its primary language. And the conclave legal teams, who were experienced and capable, spent 6 months just reading it before they said anything substantive. The agreement that eventually emerged was called the Osei Accords, named for the commander who had brought humanity from extinction to this table in the span of one human lifetime. Commander Osei Mensa herself did not lead the negotiating team. She had never been a diplomat, and she knew it, and she appointed people better suited to that particular kind of careful, patient work. She sat in on the sessions occasionally. When she did, the room had a different quality, a certain stillness, a certain awareness of weight. The conclave representatives who had been in the room long enough became able to feel when she had entered without looking up. And the Osei Accords were built on a principle that human legal scholars had argued for in their planning documents for years, that reparations, to be meaningful, should not primarily be financial. Resources could be given and resources could be lost. What humanity needed was not just material recovery, it was the restoration of everything that had been destroyed, the knowledge, the continuity, the future that had been taken away. And so the Accords required something from the conclave that was far harder to give than money or territory. They required knowledge. Every conclave civilization that had voted yes on Terra Zero was required to open its archives, fully without restriction, to human scholars. 40,000 years of accumulated science, history, technology, medicine, and philosophy. Every discovery ever made, every breakthrough ever achieved, every corner of understanding that the elder races had built up over their long existence and had never shared with species they considered lesser. All of it was to be made available to humanity, organized and translated and delivered in formats human researchers could use. The Keth, who considered their military and technological knowledge to be the most closely guarded thing they possessed, resisted this clause longer than any other. The negotiation on this single point took 4 months. In the end, they agreed because the alternative, a continuation of what had been happening to their infrastructure, their supply lines and their fleets, was not acceptable. They signed with a slow, deliberate motion of people who knew they were giving up something they would never get back. They were right. But they were also getting something they had not expected in return. Humanity's own accumulated knowledge, freely given, because Commander Osei Mensa had specifically requested this be included. The human negotiators had argued among themselves about it. Some felt that giving anything to civilizations that had committed genocide was wrong. Osei Mensa had listened to these arguments and then said plainly that they were not the elder races. They were not going to hoard their knowledge and decide who deserved it. They were going to be what they had always been, people who shared what they knew, because that was how things got better. The clause stayed in. The restoration of Earth was the term the conclave tried hardest to avoid, and the one humanity was least willing to compromise on. Earth was not just a planet. It was the meaning of everything, the place that had made them, the ground that every human name on that 11-day list had ultimately come from, however many generations back. The conclave proposed alternative worlds, prime real estate in rich star systems, worlds already terraformed and ready for settlement. The human negotiators declined all of them. They wanted their world, exactly their world. The process of restoring a planet that had been cracked at the mantle and stripped of its atmosphere and oceans was, the conclave scientists noted, genuinely at the edge of what was technically possible even with 40,000 years of knowledge. It would require the combined effort of multiple civilizations' greatest engineering teams. It would take generations of sustained work. It would be enormously expensive in resources, labor, and attention. The humans said yes. That was exactly right. That was the point. The work on Earth began within a year of the Accords being signed. It was the largest cooperative engineering project in galactic history. Teams from 11 different conclave civilizations working alongside human scientists in orbit above a ruined world, slowly, painstakingly beginning to put it back together. The first step was stabilizing the crust. This alone took 12 years. Then came the atmosphere, rebuilding it from raw materials, seeding it with the precise chemical balance that Earth's ecosystem needed. The oceans were the most complex part, requiring not just water, but the right mineral composition, the right temperature gradients, the right conditions for the microscopic life that underpinned everything else. It took 60 years. When the first rain fell on the restored Earth, real rain, from real clouds forming in a real sky above ground that was beginning, slowly, to remember how to be alive, there were humans watching it from orbit who had never stood on any planet, who had been born on ships or in asteroid settlements, and who would never fully understand from memory what that blue sky had meant to people who had lived under it for hundreds of thousands of years. But they understood it from everything else, from the stories their parents and grandparents had told, from the archives, from the art and the music and the books and the thousand different ways that humans had always tried to preserve what they were afraid of losing. Some of them cried. They did not feel embarrassed about it. Commander Yara Ose Mensa did not live to see the rain. She died 7 years into the restoration project at 88 years old in her cabin on the Endurance. She had refused to retire. She had refused repeatedly and with increasing creative profanity to leave her ship for any ceremonial position or symbolic role. She had continued to work until the last months of her life, when her health made it impossible. And even then, she had insisted on daily briefings delivered to her bedside. She was buried in space, as she had requested, in the direction of where Earth was slowly becoming itself again. Her successor, a captain named Jonas Webb, son of the weapons engineer Marcus Webb, who had helped build the Ghost Fleet's arsenal, continued her work with the quiet, focused competence she had specifically selected him for. He was not like her in personality. He was calmer, more diplomatic, less likely to use creative profanity in formal settings. He was, however, extremely effective, and he had grown up in the hollow and understood the mission with the bone-deep certainty that only people born into something can have. The other thing that happened during the restoration years, the thing that the Conclave had not planned for and could not have predicted, was what it did to the rest of the galaxy. There were many species who were not members of the Conclave. Some were young civilizations, barely off their home planets, still finding their footing in a galaxy that the elder races had always made feel slightly hostile and unwelcoming. Some were older, but had never quite fit into the Conclave's framework, remaining independent, kept at a distance, marginally tolerated. All of them had watched what happened with humanity very closely. They had watched a species get erased. They had watched the survivors refuse to die. They had watched those survivors spend 30 years in the dark, building something remarkable from grief and determination, and the particular human refusal to accept a situation just because it was the situation. They had watched humanity take the most powerful military force in the galaxy and make it look confused and slow. They had watched humanity come back to the table not to destroy but to demand justice, and had watched them get it. The message this sent was enormous. The first species to formally request an alliance with humanity was a civilization called the Vrail, a quiet, careful people who communicated primarily through scent and had spent several thousand years on the edges of conclave space being politely ignored. They had voted on nothing because they were not a conclave member. They had simply existed, carefully and without causing offense, in the way that species do when they have learned that the powerful do not always appreciate being noticed. They sent a delegation to the Compact, the loose governance structure humanity had established among the Ark survivors and their descendants. The delegation arrived with full diplomatic formality and a very long message that, when translated, essentially amounted to, "We saw what you did, we think you are right about how things should work, and we would very much like to be on your side of whatever comes next." Humanity said yes. 17 more species followed within the decade. Some were small, some were large, with resources and knowledge that proved genuinely valuable. Some had old grievances with specific conclave members that they had never had the power to address. All of them had one thing in common. They had looked at humanity and seen something they wanted to align with. Not because humanity was the most powerful force in the galaxy now, though the argument could be made, because humanity had won the way it had won, without erasing anyone, without the kind of cold, procedural decisions that had created this situation in the first place. Because when Commander Osei Mensa had sat in front of the full conclave assembly, with 41 warships in orbit above their homeworld, she had not destroyed anything. She had demanded a conversation. And that distinction mattered to people who had spent a very long time living under the kind of power that did not bother with conversations. The Galactic Conclave formally dissolved in the 63rd year after the signing of the Osei Accords. It was not a violent end. It was not sudden. It had been declining steadily as its member civilizations reconfigured their relationships, renegotiated their agreements, and slowly reorganized around the new architecture of power that had emerged. The final session of the old council was brief and procedurally correct, because 40,000 years of habit do not disappear overnight. The records were closed. The administrative systems were transferred. The Great Pale Towers on Ethan Prime were not torn down. They became the headquarters of something new. The Interspecies Compact held its first formal assembly in those towers. The chamber had been renovated. The old seating arrangement, which had placed the Keth delegation at the physical center of the room as a subtle statement about who mattered most, had been redesigned. The new arrangement was circular, every species at equal distance from every other. No center point at all. The first chair of the Interspecies Compact was a human woman named Aisha Osei Webb, granddaughter of Yara Osei Mensa. She had been born in the Hollow, in the asteroid field around the dim red dwarf that had no name, in the 23rd year after Terra Zero. She had never seen Earth until she was an adult. She had grown up in recycled air and asteroid light, playing in the corridors of ships with the children of engineers and soldiers and scientists, learning history from people who had lived it, learning purpose from the air around her. She was 50 years old when she took her seat in the compact chamber for the first time. She was small and precise, and had her grandmother's way of making a room go still when she needed it to. She had her grandmother's eyes, the kind that had learned a long time ago to see several things at once, without reacting to any of them until the right moment. She gave a short speech. She did not talk about what humanity had suffered, though everyone in the room knew it. She did not talk about what humanity had achieved, though the evidence of it surrounded them. She talked about what the compact was for, what it needed to be going forward, in a galaxy that had just learned a very expensive lesson about what happens when the powerful decide that some lives matter less than the convenience of the powerful. She said the compact existed to make sure that lesson was never forgotten and never needed to be learned again. Then she called the session to order, and the work of building something better began. The Hollow, the asteroid field around the unnamed red dwarf, was never settled or developed. By unanimous decision of what had been the Endurance Compact, the human governing body that eventually folded itself into the larger Interspecies Compact, it was preserved exactly as it was. No mining, no development, no tourism, though requests came in every year. Just the asteroids drifting slowly around their old dim star. Honad and the faint echoes of what had been built there in the dark. A marker was placed at the rough center of the field. Not large, not elaborate. A plain metal pillar with a single inscription. No images, no decoration. Just words in the first language Commander Osei Mensa had spoken as a child, and then translated into every language that the new compact recognized. The inscription read, "Here the last of us gathered. Here we decided not to end. The galaxy told us we were finished. We disagreed. What you have now came from this place, from the choice made here, in the dark, by people with nothing left but each other and enough stubbornness to call that sufficient. Do not forget where it started. Do not forget who decided. People came from a long way away to read those words. Not just humans, members of the Vrail, the Dolvin, so the Yelhari, species that had never known humanity before the compact, and had grown up knowing them only as neighbors and partners and sometimes friends. They came and they read and they were quiet for a moment, the way people are when they are standing somewhere that means more than it looks like it means. The elder races had looked at humanity and seen something to be managed, something too fast, too loud, too unpredictable, too unwilling to stay in whatever place was assigned to it. They had decided the cleanest solution was erasure. They had not understood what they were erasing. They had not understood what happened to human beings when everything was taken away, and the only thing left was the decision about what to do next. One, they had not understood that the species they were afraid of, the one that spread too fast and built too much and refused to ask permission, was only a fraction of what humanity became when given a reason. They had poked something that did not know how to stay dead. They had extinguished something that burned hotter in the dark. They had broken something that rebuilt itself into a shape the original had never been. The galaxy had tried to erase humanity. It had given humanity a reason and a direction and 30 years of uninterrupted time to become something the galaxy could not contain. And then humanity had come back, not to conquer, not to destroy, not to become the new version of what had been done to it, just to make sure that the conversation that should have happened at the beginning, the one where every voice had weight, where every life was counted, where no species made decisions about the existence of another without accountability, that conversation would finally properly, permanently begin. Outside the windows of the compact chamber on Ethan Prime, the ringed planet turned slowly in its old familiar orbit, unchanged by everything that had happened around it. Somewhere across a great deal of empty space, a small blue planet was green again in places, its oceans deep and cold and real, its sky the same soft color it had always been on a clear morning. And in the hollow the asteroids drifted. The old star burned its dim, patient red. The marker stood in the silence and said what it had always said. We decided not to end. That had been enough. It would always have been enough. It was the most human thing there was.